even now, after 20 plus years for me, I still find it a real honour and privilege that people choose us to look after their loved one and ensure that the funeral or the send-off is what they would want. So it is still now a real honour and privilege to look after every funeral we do.
Welcome to Don't Be Caught Dead, a podcast encouraging open conversations about dying and the death of a loved one. I'm your host, Catherine Ashton, founder of Critical Info, and I'm helping to bring your stories of death back to life. Because while you may not be ready to die, at least you can be prepared. Don't Be Caught Dead acknowledges the lands of the Kulin Nations and recognises their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nation peoples around the globe. Bradley Lett is a funeral director in the regional city of Sale, Victoria. He and his wife Rachel run Barry and Annette Lett Funeral Directors, a locally owned and operated family business that was established by his parents in 1995. Bradley is a father to 2 children and cheers from the sidelines at many of their cricket, basketball and netball games. They are members of the Australian Funeral Directors Association, and this is Bradley's story about inheriting a family-run funeral home. Thanks for joining us, Bradley.
You're welcome.
Your website notes that in February 2023, we mourned the loss of Annette Lett after a 2-year battle with cancer. Barry Lett sadly passed away in November 2020. After suffering from Parkinson's disease for a number of years. They will be remembered for their dedication to caring for the people of Gippsland. Now, Brad, Barry and Annette were your parents. What was it like growing up with parents running a local funeral business?
It was very different, but I do think the funeral industry was very different back then as well. Probably a lot more, not secretive, but quiet and not as spoken about. I think probably the biggest things were we found we didn't get too far from home with no mobile phones and Dad being on call a lot of the time. So probably the restrictions of travel and getting away from home was probably the biggest thing that I remember.
So no trips to Queensland or holidays of long duration, I'm assuming?
Very few and far between. Probably the biggest one was Lakes Entrance, which is probably continues on through our family as well, but very few in long distance.
And tell me, when you were at school, did the other kids know what your parents did?
Yes, they would have, but again, it wasn't spoken about from my memory, no.
Yeah, okay. And you then moved into the same profession as your parents. Did you ever want to, at some stage during your teenage years, want to follow another path, or was this all predestined?
Definitely not predestined. And to be honest, never had any intentions at all in joining the family business. On leaving school, I started an apprenticeship as a fitter and turner, and then went through a few other jobs, and it was only a phone call from Mum in April of 2000 and asking me to come and work with them, and the decision was made from that phone call to come and join them.
And what was the incident or catalyst that motivated that phone call from your mum?
I think for her it was ensuring that it continued to be a family business, and I thought she liked the idea of that and having Mum, Dad and I together.
And what was it that do you think that was the thing that she wanted to keep together and keep moving on within the family? What do you think she valued about running the funeral home?
I think for both Mum and Dad, the biggest thing for them was giving, I'll say, good service to the community And I think importantly for her, it was for our family, knowing families that we were dealing with and just that connection between families.
And how is that? Like, because being in, sales, not that small, but it's really small enough that you do really know a lot of the people that must come through to use your services. How is that?
It's tough in that it's close to home sometimes, but it's also nice in knowing the people that you're dealing with and making sure that you can do everything possible to arrange a funeral that is in with their wishes. So it certainly is almost a double-edged sword, but overall I think it's a nice thing knowing people that walk through the door. And yes, we do know lots of families that we do deal with.
Well, I know that you're our personal funeral director with our family. You've certainly, organised many funerals in our family, from my grandparents right through to my father, roughly 10 years ago now. And what is the qualities that you think that a local funeral home brings to a community?
I think the biggest quality is it's probably knowing people, giving people or families more time than you may get from a busier funeral service in Melbourne, and just making sure that every service is personalised to each family because everyone is so different. And I think that's the biggest quality.
And because your staff, how many staff do you have on here now?
So there's myself and Rachel. We have Stephen, who is a funeral director's assistant, and Coral minding the office, and then another couple of part-time staff that come to funerals in Gary Schuback and Annette Dyer.
So that's quite a close-knit team then.
It is, yep, it really is.
And so that is certainly something that would be different from what people would experience in a metropolitan area perhaps, is that consistency of staff and knowing that they're going to have that staff.
Yeah, I think so. And even I think as mourners attend a funeral, I think for people to know most of our staff as they arrive, I think is in some ways a comforting thing. Instead of a strange face, then they might have a quick chat or ask how they're going. And I think that eases even the mourners coming to funerals. And I think that helps.
Now, going back to your childhood, did you have to help your parents in the funeral home at all, like after school or anything along that line?
No, not on a regular basis. Probably only have really one or two memories of, at probably the age of maybe 16 or 17, going to help Dad at a service with Gippsland Funeral Services, but certainly not on a regular basis, no.
Okay, so you weren't folding, funeral programs or anything like that as a kid then?
No.
And what are some of your clear memories from that time when you were, forging your own career as a fitter and turner? And what were your memories and your thoughts about your parents, having the business as an adult?
I will say the forging of career as a fitter and turner probably wasn't true in some ways. My first job was to really get out of school. So it took something to get out of school, and certainly wasn't overly passionate about that. And probably being a teenager didn't give a great deal of thought to what Mum and Dad did and probably the seriousness of that. And probably that the seriousness of it didn't really come until I started. And even with Mum's first phone call asking me to come and work here, again, probably didn't really consider the seriousness of the job. And that's just come over time.
And can you explain a little bit what that seriousness means to you?
For me, it's probably having the ability to sit and listen to every person that comes through our office and trying to understand what they're wanting to achieve from their funeral, whether it be a church service, a chapel service, and making sure that you listen to what their needs are. And I think that takes a long time to work out how to listen to everyone differently. And even amongst a family, you might have different opinions, and it's trying to wade through what's right, wrong, and come up with the right answers for everybody.
And that must be a challenge. So how do you navigate that perhaps conflict that you may see in some families that come to you for funerals? Say if one party wants one thing, one party wants another.
It is difficult, but I think, and again, I'll come back to, I think it's about listening to everybody and then trying to come up with a fair and positive outcome that keeps everybody happy. And I think it is achievable on all funerals.
Could you give an example? Obviously not mentioning any names, but is there any example that comes to mind where there might have been perhaps some sort of, minor conflict or difference of opinion within a family that you've helped resolve and come to a positive outcome?
Probably a family that had a difference in thoughts between burial and cremation was probably the biggest one that I can remember.
Yeah, that is quite the difference of opinion on those two.
Yeah, it was significant, yes. Yeah.
And can I ask what the outcome was?
The family chose for cremation in the end.
Yeah, okay.
And obviously, between the two siblings, it was really them working out the best way forward, and it did take a little while to sort that out.
And was that because there was no knowledge of the deceased's wishes?
Yes. And I think that comes back to overall a big portion of society that don't feel comfortable in talking about funerals. And I think that's something we can certainly get better at.
And in your experience and opinion, how do you think that we could possibly get better at talking about death, Brad? Talking openly about death and grief can sometimes be triggering. If you find you need support, please reach out to our support services and the bereavement organisations listed on our resource hub. All links are in the show notes of this episode.
I don't know how we will get better. And it might not be openly, it might be just people at home making notes of their wishes, and again, I think making notes of your life story is certainly a good thing for families to have at the time of someone's passing in preparing eulogies and tributes, etc. So I don't know how to make society get better, but I think it certainly needs to happen.
And tell me, when your mum made that phone call to you about, can you come and join the business, Bradley? And obviously as they became ill, was there a clear sort of succession plan that they gave to you about how they wanted the business run? Or is this just something that you naturally learnt over the period of time of working with them?
There probably wasn't a clear spoken succession plan, but I will say in my first 5 to 10 years of working here, probably mum more so than dad was very hard on me in instilling the things that she felt were important within the job, and probably having that drilled into me has naturally followed through in a succession plan, I'd say.
And what were some of those things that Annette drilled into you?
It's funny, I'll come back to the same things. It's listening to people, giving your time, and and making sure that every little detail is taken care of. So it's probably all the small things that are important.
And what do you think are the small things in a funeral service that matter?
It could be things like quite simply, you might have an item sitting on top of the coffin beside the flowers that was special to that person, or a photo, or just little things that really personalise a service. Might be someone singing or families doing reading. So it's looking through the whole service and making sure that every little piece makes sense to that person and that family.
And are there questions that you ask the family when they come to you that help to personalise that service?
There are a few, but I will say again, the second step in arrangements is meeting with either a celebrant or a minister, and that probably picks up more of those bits and pieces as well. But there's certainly questions that I'll ask about flowers on top of the coffin, any particular sorts, colours, any items to sit on top of the coffin, those sorts of things. So just asking little questions. We had a service in the last 12 months where a lady was quite crafty. So we had a display of quilts, teddy bears, prints, things that she'd made in the chapel, again, which made it really personalised.
And how does that relationship work with the funeral celebrants and the minister or priest that it will be responsible for the service?
So at the time of making arrangements, my question to a family is whether they want the service to be of a religious or a non-religious nature. Once they make that decision, as part of our job, we will then contact either the celebrant or minister and arrange a meeting between the family and celebrant or minister to take the next step in working through all the service details.
And what are the things that they cover that you don't cover?
So in some ways they're both very, very similar. So they will work through discussing with families what music they'd like to play in regards to eulogies and tributes, who would like to speak, doing that. And again, with celebrants, they'll offer, I'll say, the service of perhaps writing the eulogy for the family and also delivering it, any particular readings, those sorts of things. So they'll help put together the content of the service in either the chapel or the church.
And then picking up after the service, what happens with your responsibility or role after the service is completed?
So following the service, and probably it's Coral's position more than mine at the moment, we will contact the family to discuss, obviously with cremation, their wishes in placing ashes, taking them home, purchasing an urn, with the cemetery, doing a plaque, and finalise all those things. So we certainly follow up with families afterwards, probably a week to 2 weeks after the funeral, just to make sure they're going okay and help finalise those last few things.
And that the service itself is completed with the funeral celebrant.
Yep.
So you're the one that organises the transport of the body to the crematorium or the cemetery?
Yep. So on the day of the funeral, we have our hearse there. And again, family traditionally would be involved in carrying a coffin out, placing in the hearse, and then we then move either to the crematorium, which is based at Traralgon, or to cemeteries, obviously Sale here or Maffra Stratford, probably the other two closest local cemeteries.
And would you mind talking me through the process if someone hasn't experienced a burial before at a cemetery, what's involved in that?
So probably the first thing with a burial is once we arrive at the cemetery, we would have family or family and friends involved in carrying the coffin from the hearse to the grave. The grave is always set up with a mechanical lowering device, so the family then place the coffin on top of those straps. The minister or celebrant will then work through traditionally a quite short service there at the cemetery, and then the final part would be the lowering of the coffin, And then again, we then have either petals or gum leaves, those sorts of things, for families to come forward and place on the coffin before leaving and making their way to their wake.
And if someone has chosen to be cremated, what happens normally at the end of a service on the day of the funeral?
Given that the crematorium is based in Traralgon, most families don't attend to the cremation. So if we were to have a chapel service here in Sale, the family would be involved in carrying the coffin out to place in the hearse. We may then have a guard of honour. The hearse would drive through that guard of honour and then make its way to Traralgon unattended by family.
And you're referring to chapel. Is that a religious chapel, or what is that referring to?
So we have a chapel which is up in Marley Street. It's a Delbridge Funeral Chapel. So from there, predominantly would be non-religious services, but we certainly do have ministers come and lead services from there as well. So obviously being something that we own, we can to a certain degree do whatever we want in there with the family's wishes.
Fantastic. And do you mind talking me through what happens, I suppose, the bit that we haven't covered off on, is that sort of moment where someone has died and when you get the first phone call and what sort of happens, there before the actual funeral service?
Yep. So it can vary depending on where somebody passes away. So if they were to pass away in a hospital, traditionally the hospital would move the deceased from their bed to the mortuary, and we then arrange to pick up the deceased from the hospital. If the passing is at either home or a nursing home, we may get a phone call pretty much straight away and then organise to go and actually do a transfer from nursing home or home within family's wishes of time, depending on whether there's someone else they're waiting on to come and say goodbye before we do that. But certainly can be pretty much straight away that we do receive that phone call from either a home or nursing home.
And then what happens then, Brad, before, the ceremony?
So once we have somebody here in our care, we will always organise to get some clothes so we can dress the deceased and place in the coffin. We will then at some point discuss if family are wishing to have viewings, which will traditionally be done in the days prior to the funeral. So we always take care of washing, dressing and placing deceased in the coffin.
And then is there anything else that sort of happens between that period, between then and the ceremony at all?
For us, it's paperwork. So application forms for either the cemetery or crematorium. We look after the preparation and printing of the service booklets and also preparation of photo presentations as well. So getting them done, we always provide proofs to the family to check off before we finalise everything. So yeah, it's probably mainly paperwork and then preparation of booklets and photo presentations.
And I know that with my personal experience, we've had the viewing of the body as well.
Yep. Certainly, again, in my arrangement, I will check with families if there's anybody wishing to have a viewing. As I said, traditionally that's done in the days, a couple of days prior to the funeral or the night prior to the funeral. And again, traditionally done here at our office in MacArthur Street. It certainly is a real personal preference on whether people come for a viewing or not.
And if someone chooses to come for a viewing and they haven't done a viewing previously, what can they expect to see when they arrive here?
So we have a small viewing room set up. We obviously have the deceased placed in the coffin. I think for some people it's a very tough thing to come and do and a very emotional thing to do. I think sometimes with illness, and especially if somebody's lost a lot of weight, it certainly can be a difficult thing to come and say goodbye. But hopefully overall, I think that once someone does make that decision that they do want to come and have a viewing, I think that overall, most people find it a very beneficial thing to do.
And have you ever had any requests for funerals at home, or the family wanting the body to remain at home for an extended period of time?
Yes, we have done a few, not many, but a few funerals at family homes. We certainly have had somebody may pass away at home through the night, and families choose to leave their loved one there at home overnight and have us come the next morning to pick up. So yes, for both, but overall not a huge number of either.
And have you ever had requests for interesting coffins or interesting clothes to dress people in?
Probably not a lot in regards to interesting clothes. Probably my advice to anybody would be is to dress their loved one in something that they feel was them, whether that be something comfortable, something formal. So not a whole lot on the interesting side with clothes. I think with coffins, they continue to change. Probably one of the biggest changes has been the vinyl wrap type coffins, where people can design things or choose flowers or cars and really personalise a coffin. Again, we haven't had lots, but I think probably the vinyl wrap style coffins are one of the biggest changes, yeah.
Wow, and how long have they been sort of in the market and an option?
Good question. Probably around 10 years thereabouts, but I'd say probably the last 5 years or so, people have been starting to feel more comfortable in doing different things, I think. Because I think it's a very traditional type industry, I think.
And tell me, you're married with 2 children. How does your family feel about being the local funeral director?
To be honest, the kids know no different. So I don't think it certainly doesn't bother them in any way.
And what ages are they again?
18 and 14.
Okay, so it would have come up as an issue for the 18-year-old by now if that was going to be the case.
I would think so, yes. So no, it certainly doesn't bother them. They're comfortable talking about work. It's certainly not something we don't discuss, but it certainly doesn't bother them or upset them in any way.
And has your role affected your conversations that you have with them about death? Has there been any impact in the family home by what you do for a job?
I don't think any impact. Probably, if anything, and again, go back to my childhood and the less frequency of holidays, I think has probably continued on to our family. But I certainly don't think it's impacted them in a negative way.
And in a way that could be positive, conversations about death, are they open conversations? Have you talked about planning for, when death does occur?
We certainly don't talk about planning, but I think in a positive way, you might hear at a funeral a funny story or just an interesting thing that somebody has done in their life. And I'll certainly, when I go home, if I think that that's appropriate, I'd certainly share that with them.
And what challenges do you face as a regional funeral director?
Probably the biggest challenge is the challenge of knowing people and just that emotional side of dealing with people you know. But that challenge certainly does then have the reward in looking after your people you know. So it is a very unique one. So probably the biggest challenge is dealing with people you know and looking after people you know. But that certainly does have a positive side as well.
And we've touched a little bit, obviously, on the conversations you've had in your own family. But prior to being involved in the business and when you were growing up, when did you have conversations about your parents about their death and dying? What was the kitchen table conversations in the Lett household?
It certainly wasn't funeral-based conversations. And again, I'll come back to, I think that overall the funeral industry isn't spoken about a lot because of maybe the uncomfortable nature of it. So we certainly didn't discuss it a lot. And even once I started here, certainly before Mum and Dad were unwell, we certainly didn't discuss their wishes either, which is interesting.
And did that make things more challenging for you? Because I'm assuming you had to organise their funerals.
Yes, I did arrange and look after both Mum and Dad's funerals. The conversation with Mum regarding hers, she certainly gave me all of her wishes, but that was probably in the last fortnight of her life. So that's how close we were to that. But I certainly did get all her wishes.
And with your father?
In some ways, Mum and Dad were very different. Dad certainly didn't give lots of instruction about his funeral as such. He actually did spend quite a bit of time with a celebrant that he knew quite well and gave a lot of his life story to her in the last couple of years of his life. And sadly for Dad, his passing was through COVID time. So obviously we had restrictions on numbers, like many other families through that. So that did sort of restrict what we could do with his funeral. But I certainly felt for Dad with live streaming, and again, lots of families were affected by COVID times. I thought that with live streaming, we were able to share his story, which was important. But in different ways, they both did give some instructions, but probably less from Dad than Mum.
And what do you find that families find the most challenging aspects of arranging a funeral or when a loved one has died?
The obvious one of just dealing with loss. I think a couple of the most challenging things are putting together somebody's life story, and I think choosing photos for your photo presentation, because it's hard to condense somebody's life to 80 or 100 photos and a 5 to 10 minute eulogy. And I think also with the eulogy, at the time of loss, sometimes it's very hard to remember all those little stories or dates when they went to school or things that they did, because I think just naturally you're not functioning correctly.
And what have you seen in your experience when people haven't planned or they don't know the wishes of a loved one? What impact has that had?
I think it can have a small impact, but I'd hope that after my meeting and making those arrangements, we can work through what the right decisions are, point them in the right direction with almost a list of things that they will need to do, and then I think we're right. But it's all from my first meeting or my first arrangement with the family. If there is indecision, for me, it's maybe taking a little bit more time to work through what their options are and making sure that they make the right decisions.
And from your personal experience, how do you suggest people can support someone who has just had a loved one die?
For me, I think being yourself is important. And I think to a certain degree, maintaining the same sort of friendship is important as well. Because I think sometimes when you're going through loss, just being normal for a while can be a good thing, because it's very tough to lose someone. So I think maintaining your same friendship and the person you are, just keeping that is important.
Has there been any incidents where it's actually influenced your thoughts on death?
Probably. But to a certain degree, I think for me, it's a fine line on how much you take on board. So it might be looking after funerals of younger people or close family friends that can become quite confronting. But I think it's finding the line where to stop thinking about that too much and impacting your life. Because I think if you let it, it could probably become a negative thing for a funeral director.
And what do you do to make sure that that line stays in place?
It's a very difficult one. Across the course of time, I've found going to watch the kids play sport is probably, for me, the best way to switch my mind off for a little while.
Well, I'm glad you've got something that allows you to do that. And have you done anything yourself to actually plan for your own death?
No. No is the short answer.
It's okay, Bradley. You're not the only one.
No, I haven't.
Given your personal experience, is there any advice or encouragement you'd like to share with others?
In contradiction to what I've just said about myself, I think planning is important. I think it's helpful for families to know choices between burial or cremation, where leaving notes on your life story could be done. I think that's helpful. So I think probably planning is the best thing that people can do.
You know I'm going to ask this question. So, given everything we've just discussed, what do you think is the one thing that stopped you from planning for your own death?
It's probably knowing what the right thing to do is. For myself, I would probably say it's knowing whether to have a service. I find myself, I'm a very private person and probably don't like to talk about myself, certainly don't like my photos taken, those sorts of things. So I find, for me, the thought of somebody talking about me and looking at photos of my life doesn't feel quite right for me. But that probably just doesn't fit the right mold in helping others to grieve.
That was going to be my next question. Given that, with what you see, the role of ritual and ceremony plays in the grieving process, do you think a funeral or a service is an important part of the grieving process?
Yes, it is. In some ways, probably I would say probably the funerals, a funeral service is more about the living than the deceased. Is a short answer.
And tell me, is there anything else you'd like to share at all, Bradley?
Overall, even now, after 20 plus years for me, I still find it a real honour and privilege that people choose us to look after their loved one and ensure that the funeral or the send-off is what they would want. So it is still now a real honour and privilege to look after every funeral we do.
There's not a lot of people that can say that they find their job is a privilege. So, yeah, especially after 20 years.
Oh, I know. I feel like a dinosaur when I say that.
No, not at all.
Yeah, it is a very important job because I think making sure that things go correctly can shape how people move forward with their lives after a loss. So I think it is important making sure that things are done right in helping people to move forward in a positive way. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Bradley. I really appreciate it. I think that's a good spot to end on. Lovely. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Bradley. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Be Caught Dead, brought to you by Critical Info. If you liked the episode, learnt something new, or were touched by a story you heard, we'd love for you to let us know. Send us an email, even tell your friends. Subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. If you can spare a few moments, please rate and review us as it helps other people to find the show. Are you dying to know more? Stay up to date with Don't Be Caught Dead by signing up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Head to don'tbecaught.dead.com for more information and loads of resources.